Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all the ships at sea. 51 CIA agents. Does that begin to ring a bell? Please allow us to delve deep into a modern coup d'etat in the United States of America and the cover-up that ensued. From its inception, the Central Intelligence Agency, established under President Truman in 1947, was about overthrowing governments. Asian, South American, African, it did not matter to them, so long as the current ruler in place was somehow distasteful to the current United States regime. The CIA were sowing the seeds of discord among the populace and overseeing the entire coup process. Fast forward to 2020 and the U.S. presidential election. It was known to 51 current and former CIA agents that President Donald Trump would run for election to a second term in office, and that he was a serious threat to their plans to undermine the United States government, its citizens' constitutional rights, and the very backbone of its societal norms. The Democratic political party was their party of choice, and anyone or anything that stood in the way of their preferred candidate winning the 2020 election had to go. Nothing could stand in their way. But how would they go about such an enormous task, you ask? The plan was carefully crafted in the waning days of the Barack Obama regime in secretive conversations between Obama, Hillary Clinton, and then CIA Director John Brennan. There is a widely distributed video clip from 2016 where Hillary, Barack, and John are in a room together discussing how they cannot allow Trump to gain the presidency and how they plan to do everything within their powers to make sure it does not happen. This goes beyond the standard political incentive to beat the other party in the upcoming election. No, rather, this is scheming and planning on a scale never seen before in American politics. Richard Nixon needs an apology at this point because the crimes that his administration committed pale in comparison. Go back for a moment to the October 2020, the month leading up to the presidential election. The New York Post revealed that a laptop computer had, in fact, been turned into the FBI by a Delaware computer repairman. The real importance of that report was that the laptop computer did not belong to just anybody, but to the son of the main Democratic presidential candidate, Joe Biden. The reports from the New York Post were that the laptop computer actually contained much evidence of crimes having been committed by Hunter Biden, crimes such as having received illicit multi-million-dollar bribes from major politicians in Ukraine, Russia, and China, among others. As soon as the laptop became known, operatives within the CIA and DNC began crafting a plan. The plan was to paint the laptop as Russian disinformation, something they had become very crafty and skilled at using before. It was at this particular moment that 51 current and former CIA operatives gathered and agreed to sign off on a fraudulent letter stating that the laptop was a hoax and that it had, quote, all the earmarks of Russian disinformation, unquote. Really? Remember the Steele dossier? Russian collusion? So much of the American public bought it hook, line, and sinker. In fact, it seems that around 2016 to 2020, automatically believing what the mass media were reporting was in high fashion. No questions asked whatsoever. Never mind the fact that so much of that media cadre was in fact left-leaning and highly liberal in their editorializing style and structure. So many of those living in urban areas, their only source of news was normally the major television networks, all heavily left-leaning. Is it any wonder that so many major cities vote heavily Democratic in elections? But I digress. At this point, let's waste no more time and name the 51 agents. They are as follows. Mike Hayden, former CIA director. Jim Clapper, former Director of National Intelligence. Leon Panetta, former CIA Director and Defense Secretary. John Brennan, former CIA Director. Thomas Fingard, former National Intelligence Council Chair. Rick Leggett, former National Security Agency Deputy Director. John McLaughlin, former CIA Acting Director. Michael Morrell, former CIA Acting Director. Mike Vickers, former Defense Undersecretary for Intelligence. Doug Weiss, former Defense Intelligence Agency Deputy Director. Nick Rasmussen, former National Counterterrorism Center Director. Russ Travers, former National Counterterrorism Center Acting Director. Andy Leitman, former National Counterterrorism Center Acting Deputy Director. John Mosman, former CIA Chief of Staff. Larry Pfeiffer, former CIA Chief of Staff. Jeremy Bash, former CIA Chief of Staff. Rodney Snyder, former CIA Chief of Staff. Glenn Gerstel, former National Security Agency General Counsel. David Priest, former CIA Analyst and Manager. Pam Persili, former CIA Deputy Director of Analysis. Mark Polymeropoulos, former CIA Senior Operations Officer. Chris Savos, former CIA Senior Operations Officer. John Tullius, former CIA Senior Intelligence Officer. David A. Vanell, former CIA Senior Operations Officer. Kristen Wood, former CIA Senior Intelligence Officer. David Buckley, former CIA Inspector General. Nada Bakos, former CIA Analyst and Targeting Officer. Patty Brandmeier, former CIA senior intelligence officer. James B. Bruce, former CIA senior intelligence officer. David Karians, former CIA intelligence analyst. Janice Karians, former CIA operational support officer. Paul Colby, former CIA senior operations officer. Peter Corsell, former CIA analyst. Brett Davis, former CIA senior intelligence officer. Roger Zane George, former national intelligence officer. Stephen L. Hall, former CIA senior intelligence officer. Kent Harrington, former national intelligence officer. Don Hepburn, former national security executive. Timothy D. Kilbourne, former dean of CIA's Kent School of Intelligence Analysis. Ron Marks, former CIA officer. Jana Holstein Mendez, former CIA technical operations officer. Emil Nakle, former director of CIA's Political Islam Strategic Analysis Program. Gerald A. O'Shea, former CIA senior operations officer. Nick Shapiro, former CIA deputy chief of staff and senior advisor to the director. John Cipher, former CIA senior operations officer. Stephen Slick, former National Security Council senior director for intelligence programs. Cynthia Strand, former CIA deputy assistant director for global issues. Greg Tarbell, former CIA deputy executive director. David Terry, former National Intelligence Collections Board chairman. Greg Treverton, former National Intelligence Council chair, and Winston Wiley, former CIA Director of Analysis. Every single one of these in the least deserves to be tried for interfering with a federal election, yet not a single charge has been brought by the Merrick Garland Department of Injustice. Where is the national outcry for justice to be served? Why are almost nobody protesting for these agents to be put on trial in order to get to the bottom of this incident? What we have, for all practical appearances, is a rogue government agency never established by the United States Constitution or envisioned by the Founding Fathers, not elected by the citizens, establishing itself as an agent of throwing the results of U.S. federal elections. What will be done to right this wrong? Wake up, America. Who does the CIA director answer to in the federal government? It turns out it's a rather obscure presidential cabinet position of Director of National Intelligence, with appointment by the acting U.S. President that is nothing less than a recipe for disaster, as we have seen with this. Why not have the CIA accountable directly to the U.S. Congress, or better yet, elected by the citizens? No, instead it seems to be an agency rife for all kinds of illegal shenanigans. In fact, the acting CIA director, William Burns, has done a grand total of 0 to hold these fraudsters accountable. The acting president, his boss's boss, benefits from this inactivity. That is by no means a conflict of interest, is it? Exactly the same reason we have seen 0 out of Merrick Garland and Christopher Wray on well-known felonies committed by the Biden crime cartel is the same reason we have seen no one in the fraudulent administration take action on these heinous crimes committed by 51 current and former CIA agents. Allow me to summarize. What these 51 agents of the federal government, supposed public servants, essentially performed was in fact election interference. U.S. Code Title 18, Section 529, distinctly establishes what each of these 51 agents have committed as a crime punishable by fines, 1 year in prison, or both. Why then has nothing been done to date to these yet? That time is now, my loyal viewers, to contact every elected representative you can regarding this great disservice of justice. Take back your nation. Let them know that their inactivity on this matter is completely unacceptable and that you will not accept this 1 minute longer. If they fail to act, the time to vote them out of office is the very next election. This has very serious ramifications going forward for our nation. Do not take it lightly. Good night and sleep well.